My name is Jenny Zelt. I am a supervisor in Pima County, and I also am in a dual role. I'm a supervisor and also work as the Pima County Juvenile Court Liaison. In Maricopa County, Pinal County, and Pima County, DCS have staff who are actually outstationed at the juvenile court to do a plethora of helpful things, and so I am one of those folks in Pima County. So I have worked with DCS for 20 years now. I think I qualify as a lifer. That's the internal term for that. I started off working as an investigator a long time ago in feels like a previous life. I've been an ongoing case manager, a supervisor, and an assistant program manager. And so I've done a little bit of everything. The good news about that is that I like to be able to answer folks' questions and make sense of things that don't always make sense from the outside. And so I hope that I can answer most of your questions today, either in the information that we're talking about or questions that you have along the way. So let me definitely say, if you have a question, a thought, something that doesn't quite click about what we're talking about, please just put your hand up and we'll talk about that along the way. If you have a question about that thing that you heard about DCS or you heard about how things work in dependency cases, but it's not really what we're talking about, please jot that down and we'll have a few minutes at the end for random questions. The next hour and 15 minutes is the most information that you are going to get about DCS, about the department, kind of the behind the scenes things. So this is really the time to think about those things that you've wondered about, and for us to dispel kind of some of those things that are true and not always true, or they're true but it's missing part of the information. So, and I will say just before I start, I've had the blessing of kind of seeing different systems from different perspectives. In a previous life in Indiana, anybody here a Hoosier or a Boilermaker? All right. So in a previous life in Indiana, I was a juvenile probation officer. And then I moved to Arizona and I got hired by DCS, or what was DCYF at that time, and kind of learned that what is hard about a lot of jobs is what we don't know about other people's work. And so in the last 20 years, I've had the benefit of being involved in a lot of committees and collaborations, which has really just solidified for me that the more that we know about how other systems work or what other people's jobs are, the more we can work strategically to get things done for families. And so that's really the perspective that I come at this about, and that's true for all of us. That's true for DCS staff. What we know about CASAs and juvenile probation and other entities helps us. What you all, the understanding you have about the other entities, will help you in your work as a CASA, hopefully. So, we live in a diverse state here in Arizona, like most states are, and if you took a poll, there are people who think that DCS should do more. There are people who think that DCS should do less, and there are the people who are kind of in the middle. And thankfully, DCS's role is not what I think it should be, and it's not what you think it should be. It's what we, the people, think it should be. And Arizona's statute actually says what the role of DCS is. An interesting thing that a little plug, I don't know what your favorite search engine is, if it's Google or Bing or something else, but it's a beautiful thing that you can put in Arizona Revised Statutes, and you can go to Title 8 and read pretty much almost every statute that's ever been written that's on the books in Arizona about child welfare work. So it's just something helpful to know, because you can go there at any time in the future and find information on adoptions and removals and the whole gamut. So Title 8 talks about what DCS's job is. And this is really what we, the people, through our legislature, has said the role of DCS is. And it really matches up with the types of case management that we have and that we see in the field. That it's our role to protect children by investigating reports, that it's our role to assess, promote, and support the safety of children in a permanent home. It doesn't necessarily specify home of origin or other home, so it really ends up being both sometimes. And then recently there was added, I don't know that this really changed what folks did in the field, because I think we always did this, but it was specified that our role is to, without compromising safety, to coordinate services to achieve permanency, and also to work with law enforcement when that's appropriate on child welfare cases. So this is actually says what DCS should do, and it does match up with our investigations. The idea of our providing services to families in home, ongoing case management, permanency, which sometimes means adoption and guardianship and those types of things. So you all are going to be assigned to a child or a sibling group, a case, and those cases are going to have different dynamics. Some cases are going to be cases that came in for neglect. Some are going to be cases that came in for physical abuse. Some, a smaller number, for sexual abuse. Maybe a really small number for emotional abuse. Those are the 4 categories that our reports come in under. Sometimes a couple of categories, sometimes just one, as you can imagine. But I can guarantee you that every case that all of you are ever associated with has one thing in common for sure. Any guesses what it is? Neglect? Neglect, I think you could argue that all of our children suffer what feels like neglect in some way, but this is really the thing. Yes? You know, I've had that conversation with a lot of folks. Probably emotional trauma, but not necessarily emotional abuse the way that the law defines it. The only thing that every single one of your cases will have in common is that it actually started with somebody in the community picking up the phone and calling the hotline. Because some cases are going to be cases where there's neglect because of drug abuse, but there really isn't physical abuse or emotional abuse. There's love and bonding and attachment. All the cases are going to be different. Every single case started with somebody picking up the phone and calling the DCS hotline. That is the only way for a case to open, in fact. And that's really important, because that is what keeps us out of a situation where anybody can accuse the department, well, you just opened up this case because you felt like it. No, we opened up this case because somebody called the hotline, and that's documented. So different types of folks can call the hotline. Have any of you ever had the pleasure? As a mandatory reporter, usually? Yeah. So a lot of folks are mandatory reporters in different aspects of their life. And over 50% of our reports are called in by folks who are mandatory reporters. But then I would say a good portion, probably 40%, are called in by discretionary reporters, the folks who are listed over here on the left-hand side. A question came up a few years ago about where CASAs fall in that category. And what would seem instinctual to you? Would it seem instinctual to you that CASAs would be That is pretty much everybody's instinct, but they are not. Any guess why? So she said, so that kids could feel comfortable confiding in CASAs. The reality is that doesn't really work, and I don't think I suspect that's not the reason, because you really do have to report if a kid says, my mom's boyfriend used to molest me, my mom used to beat me, and nobody knows about that yet. You really are going to report that out of your conscience and kind of I think because you're a CASA, and that's why you're a CASA. It's really because it's left out of the law. Every state in the union, and many of you probably lived a substantial part of your life in another state, every state in the union is required to have a mandatory reporting law. They all are written differently and specify a different list of folks who are reporters. So because you're not specifically named, the Attorney General's office determined that you're not mandatory reporters. But what we always kind of say is it doesn't matter. Because if a child that you're working with discloses something that's happening now in their placement, God forbid, we hope that doesn't happen, but we have 13,000 children, right, in foster care status, and so it's going to happen sometime. Or a child discloses sexual abuse or physical abuse that happened 6 months before they came into care, but that wasn't why they came into care. You're going to want to make that report. You're going to need to make that report to the hotline and let the assigned case manager know. So unfortunately, those are some of the instances where that might come up and where you might have a need to call the hotline. I also want to mention, Sue mentioned earlier, that if a child has an emergency when you're with them, you know that your first call is to 911 and then your second call is to DCS. The thing that's difficult about that is that if it's at 6 o'clock at night, nobody's answering the phone at the DCS office. If it's on Saturday, nobody's answering the phone. And sometimes if it's 3 in the afternoon, the case manager's at court and they're not answering the phone. So your backup always 100% of the time is the DCS hotline. Okay, for anything in terms, even getting in touch with the case manager or about an emergency, not always just calling in a report. Any questions or thoughts about those things?
Is there a way to also electronically send them the report so there's a data stamp that would have complied with the priority timelines?
That's a good question. The question is there a way to electronically make the report so that there's a track record of that report? The answer to that is yes and no. There actually is, the hotline actually did put in place a way for mandatory reporters. Generally, it's used by schools personnel and by law enforcement to make non-emergency reports electronically. The thing that's awkward about it is you have to go in and you have to create a profile, and I would tell you, if I was going to call once a year or less, I would probably not do it that way, because you can't do it for anything urgent anyway, because those are things that go into a box and then get taken care of within 24 or 48 hours. And so, but my advice to you is that if you call the hotline, you want to write down, the person who answers the phone will tell you their name, and if they don't or you miss it, you can document, I called at this date and time and I talked to Jenny Zelt. And you can even ask them, I'm just documenting this for my own purposes, can you also give me the name of your supervisor? That way, that is pretty good documentation. I will tell you, they tape record every call for QA purposes, and every call, whether it's a report or not, is documented and they're able to find it. And in 20 years, I've never had anybody say they called and they couldn't find the communication. In 20 years, I've never, and I was on the investigative side for a long time. Yeah, really good question about how to document. So when those calls go into the hotline, they are prioritized. Some of you may have heard, or if you've worked in child welfare or touched child welfare work in any way, that there's a priority code. This is a P1 report. This is a P3 report. This is a P4 report. And those things have to do with not that certain reports are unimportant, but that some reports require somebody to get in their car right now and go and retrieve a child from a police officer in the street, or to go to a school so that a child doesn't go home to a molester that day that what they just made a disclosure about. And some calls are about more chronic things, or they're about things that happened 6 months ago that need to be addressed, that need to be investigated, but not within 2 hours. What do you think about those P1 reports? Can you think of some other examples that might be P1 reports? Well, they certainly would, I think, unless, and sometimes officers, if they're arresting mom for something, if they're arresting her for something that's not a child welfare situation, they might just allow mom to turn the children over to grandma or grandpa. But we live in a state where not everybody has a lot of relatives near them. Some folks do and some folks don't. We live in a kind of a transient state. So police officers do have to arrest folks, and the kids are there with the parent, and or the kids at home. The parent says, oh my gosh, my kid's at home, and they're expecting me to be home and I don't have any family. And so they would call us, absolutely. Yes? Sure. Yeah, if they're threatening to self-harm right now. Now, the thing that's an interesting distinction about that is that, and I sometimes use the term that we are the parent caretaker police. And so if a child is suicidal, does that mean that their parent is abusive or neglectful? No, it might. It might, right? And in some instances, children are suicidal and their parents or their guardians are not interested in getting them any help, and that is neglectful. The same way that a child who is a severe diabetic needs medical help. A child in that situation needs behavioral health assistance. But so that might be a report to us, or it might not be a report, depending. I think the example that you gave is a really interesting one, because some of you are going to be assigned to cases where you're going to read the first court report, and there was like a major scary event that took place that kicked everything off. And others of you are going to get assigned to children, and you're going to read that first court report, and there wasn't a scary event. There was a lifetime of this. Mom's drinking more and more and more and more and more and getting more depressed. Or mom and dad used to just fight once in a while, but the domestic violence got worse and worse and worse and worse over time. So you're going to find that some of you are going to be assigned to a child who has had this situation and some with this situation. And what I mean about your example is we find that just because something is a P1 report doesn't mean that it's going to be a long-term removal. If mom's getting arrested for burglary and her 10-year-old is home alone and she doesn't have any relatives in town, so we have to go take care of the 10-year-old, when mom gets bailed out the next day, is she a danger to her child? Really, no. I mean, she's making poor choices, but there are lots and lots and lots of folks who are on probation for burglary and all kinds of things that we don't determine as being unfit parents necessarily, that we go and pick up their children. So sometimes emergency situations don't lead to dependency cases. Yeah, I have to defer that question a little bit because that is so recent, there's not a process in place for it yet. What I would say about that in general terms is that I've had an understanding for many years now that every state, the way that they do removals is different. And there are pros and cons to each kind. In some states, law enforcement does most of the removals, and the Child Welfare Agency just does some, where they do different types. So right now, the state and the courts, DCS and the courts, and I think law enforcement's going to be involved in that conversation to a degree, are really working through what is that going to look like. And so nobody's really figured out for sure exactly what it looks like, but people are urgently working on it right now and trying to not worry about it too much, because it's worrisome to a lot of our DCS staff, because we worry, oh my gosh, what if I feel like a child needs to be removed? I go to get a warrant and I go back and then they're gone, and so working through those things and how we don't put kids in more jeopardy is of paramount concern right now. So really good question. So these reports, whether they're chronic reports or whether they're, oh my gosh, this terrible thing happened today report, they come in, they get assigned, and in some instances, the children are found to be unsafe. This alludes to a little bit. It says, report investigated, the child found unsafe. That alludes to, I just want to say, in all reports, the children are not found unsafe. I just have to say that, because every investigator that we have is assigned, depending on where they work and what the staffing levels are assigned between 10 and 20 reports a month. Well, thank goodness they're not having to remove 15 or 20 children or sets of siblings every single month. So our reports run the gamut of very serious and less serious. So in about 12 to 15% of our reports, the children are found to be unsafe. And so in those instances, if it's an emergency situation, we need to remove the children quickly or do what needs to happen to remove the children quickly. Sometimes we can schedule a team decision-making meeting before the removal and talk about it. Either way, we are going to have a meeting called a team decision-making meeting. And when you read that first court report that I've alluded to, it's going to reference that a team decision-making meeting occurred. And sometimes that team decision-making meeting that's facilitated by a specially trained DCS facilitator and has the parents in the room and whatever grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins that we can get in the room or on the phone, counselors, people from the school who are working with the kiddo, whoever we can get in the room in that short of a period of time. Sometimes we come up with solutions that result in a dependency petition not having to be filed. I would say to you, the majority of the time we do have to move forward with a dependency petition, and that's a good thing, because I would be worried if statistically we were removing removing children, and then a day later when we're meeting, 2/3 of them we send home. That would tell you, well, then you perhaps shouldn't have removed some of those children in the first place. So it's only a small percentage where we're able to work out a non-dependency solution. The thing that comes out of those team decision-making meetings more often are placement options. Because when investigators remove children from parents on a Monday afternoon, that parent is in extreme trauma, and it is not uncommon for them to either not be able or willing to provide us with information about who we could place their child with, who is a relative or a kin. But then when we get into a room a day later, I mean, I've been involved in cases where children have been removed from mom and dad or mom or dad, and they say, I have no family. And we get in the room a day later and there's 15 people in the room, because it's hard for parents to process things in that moment, and they're embarrassed and they're hoping they don't have to tell anybody, and then they realize that it's better to do so. So when a dependency petition needs to be filed, the investigator works with the Attorney General's office to file that, because we're not lawyers and we're not trained in writing legal briefs and things like that, and you'll be trained by Penny from the AG's office right after lunch. And some of our information will touch on each other. The court looks at the petition, determines that the information in the petition was sufficient for the child or children to be removed, signs temporary orders, and then there's a hearing in about a week. When I started working for the agency 20 years ago, I came in just before this thing called model court started 20 years ago, about 19 years ago. And at that time, if a child was removed from a parent, if the parent did not get in their car and drive to the court and request a hearing in 5 days, the first hearing was not for 3 weeks. And I'll be honest with you, in those 3 weeks, not a lot of stuff usually happened, because the parent's over here in denial, DCS is just working on the child's placement. There weren't a lot of services that were necessarily happening, and there might not have been a lot of visits happening. Now the first hearing is about 7 real days from the removal, and there are referrals and visits and other important things like TDM meetings happening between that referral and court. So the status quo now compared to 20 years ago is hugely different in Arizona and in a lot of other states. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, imagine a case where a child's at a hospital, has an injury that the doctor thinks is from abuse. What happens to the child while all these things are happening? And that's a really good question, and a lot of good things are happening. So if a child is at the hospital on Monday and they're being discharged on Monday, but the doctor says this is a break that only happens from abuse, and I'm willing to testify and it's in my notes, then I have to remove that child, no matter where the parents live. And this is the thing about abuse cases and other cases. Doesn't matter how nice the parents seem or feel, but if it's abuse, it's abuse. That I'm going to place that child in the best place I can. If I can place the child with a relative that we can clear DPS checks, DCS checks, see their home and interview them, who's going to be protective, then I can place with a relative or kin. If I can't, I'm going to place that child in the next best licensed option I have, that hopefully is a foster home, because foster homes, unlike group homes, are most like a regular home. And then we send a referral to the behavioral health side of the world, and a thing called a rapid response takes place. And so somebody from the behavioral health entity in your county will go see that child and provide an assessment, and services would start for them, in terms of whatever counseling or therapies that they might need, kind of to deal with the trauma that they've experienced from the removal. And then we do kind of rely on those placements to give us feedback about what they need and what the child needs, and the case moves forward. Yeah, and I'll tell you, when I mentioned model court and how the status quo is so much better now than 20 years ago. I remember being in a training for model court and saying to somebody, oh my gosh, what happens if I'm sick 2 days after I remove a child? Because there are like 20 things that have to happen in the week after that, and by the way, that's not my only case. And they were like, well, yeah, you'll figure it out, and so there are a lot of things. There's there's the legal side, there's the kid side, there's the visit side, there's the parent services referral side. There is a huge list of things that happen really fast. No, hopefully not. I mean, occasionally, but I would say, I wish I could give you stats, but we are always going to place that day with a relative if we know of a relative and we can clear them. And
Okay, but when you say you need to clear them, isn't that part of like clearing us through the process?
we don't do polygraphs at that point. We can do immediate Department of Public Safety checks that will give us a national registry check. We check our own database. If there have been any child welfare reports on that person, then we go see their home. And that's the beautiful thing about our unit system is we will dispatch different people in different directions to do different things. So while the investigator's at the hospital, we can send a peer to the grandma's house, or as soon as, and we do have some local kind of holding. We do sometimes hang on to kids for an hour or two while we're waiting to clear aunt and uncle so we can get them there. So as we said, a lot of things happen really, really quickly, but this is the part that's really important for you all. The dependency cases transfer from from investigators to ongoing case managers. And that's important because those are the folks that you're going to have the majority of your interface with, ongoing case managers. We talked a little bit about the investigative case manager's duties. And then these ongoing folks are the folks who have really high caseloads, unfortunately. It varies a lot, but an ongoing case manager, depending on where you are in the state, is going to have between 20 and 40 cases. Those of you who are in Maricopa County, your ongoing case managers are the worst strapped caseload-wise right now. And historically that's been the case, but especially right now. So imagine an ongoing case manager has 30 cases. That's not 30 kids, that's 30 cases. So probably when I look at those cases, they probably average about 2 to 2.5 kids on each case. So let's say that's 60 kids. So that's 60 kids they're responsible for. Now we're working reunification services with 60 moms and 60 to 120 dads potentially. So that adds up to a lot of people on the cases that they are responsible for having regular contact with. And that's where the rub comes in for ongoing case managers, that they need to make sure that the kids are doing well in their placements. They need to make sure that mom and dad or mom and dads have the referrals they need. They need to write court reports for court hearings, make sure that all the services are in place. And then this one is the one that frankly is the most tragic sometimes. They need to be aware of changes that take place. There are all these routine things that have to happen. Court hearings, court reports, visits and placements, all those things. But one of the hardest things that happens for ongoing case managers is when, and this happens, I can think of several cases where I had ongoing case managers crying in my office, where 2 months earlier they got to return an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old back home to mom, and then they find out from the family, and then they go and talk to the kids and confirm that mom just reunified with her abusive boyfriend, who's the reason the kids were removed, and he's not participated in any services, but he's sleeping in the home every night. So what does that ongoing case manager have to do? Go back out and remove these kids who get traumatized a second time. Or the parent who has addiction issues and has been on the wagon, so to speak, for 4 months and falls off. Not the fall off where, hey, yeah, I came up positive, I fell out, I know I need to re-engage, I know I took some things for granted, but we can work with some things like that, but sometimes parents don't fall off that clear with those types of that clear vision. And so unfortunately, sometimes kids have to be removed a second time because you can't predict when those things are going to happen or not happen. You can try to from feedback from therapists, but you just can't be sure all the time. question comes up a lot, and we cover a lot of these things I mentioned already, but the question comes up a lot. What does an average day look like for an ongoing case manager? And that's a really hard question to answer, mostly because these are the things that fill up their days. But the reason it's a hard question to answer is that day when that case manager gets that status communication through the computer that grandma called the hotline, that mom reunified, and they go out to the school and the kids confirm. That day, whatever they were doing that day, they're not doing now. Because they're now going to the school, removing the children, finding out if they can take them back to their previous placement, and literally that can be a 4 or 5, 6 hour process depending on how many kids there are. So these are the types of things that happen for them every day and every week. And one of the things that's kind of hard there are so many things that have pros and cons. It's a good thing to have frequent court hearings, to have everybody getting in front of the judge to review things, right? For every court hearing that's a review hearing, the case manager has to write a 3 to 8 page court report. So it's a good thing for us all to get together and check progress, but those court reports add up, and that's time that they're not in the field always seeing kids. So everything kind of comes with a cost, unfortunately, for ongoing case managers. Any thoughts or questions about kind of the case manager's role? Yes. Go ahead.
What does a caseworker typically make range-wise, income?
I used to work at our regional office, and I used to know this. I think they start at around 41 right now. Yeah. So, good question. They have bachelor's degrees. I'm going to be honest, we used to be really specific. You used to have a social work, psychology, sociology, criminal justice degree. And a few years ago, we kind of figured out that we were losing a lot of people with good experience. Like there were folks who worked in the behavioral health world for 6 years as a case manager at a behavioral health provider, but their degree was in English, and we couldn't even interview them. So now we can interview anybody with basically any bachelor's degree. Yes.
When they're returned to the home, and then something goes wrong, when they return to the home, is the CASA that they had done? And so no. So the CASA appointment runs along with, and I apologize. Are you guys who's a little bit like questioning this word dependency, or is that a word that's on all of your radars? The department, different states use different terms, and in Arizona, DCS files a dependency petition, so it's called a dependency case, so they're called dependent children. So your assignment runs with the dependency case after you're assigned. Well, when children are returned home, it's very, very, very rare. Like I can't say enough varies there. It's extremely rare for the dependency to be dismissed at the same time a child is returned home, which I hope is logical. It doesn't really make sense. The kids are out of home, there are all these services in place, now we're going to throw these 3 kids back home, and every service having to do with the court or DCS is going to disappear. Like that's just like setting everybody up for failure. So generally the dependency case will stay open from 4 to 8 months or so after kids return home. So you would still be the CASA because the dependency would still be open. The only time that you wouldn't be is if a child went home, that kind of additional, 6 months, let's just say, of support and services and monitoring goes on and things look good, and then the judge dismisses the dependency, and then 6 months later, a new report comes into us that's equally serious or more serious, and we have to remove. You wouldn't automatically be appointed at that point, but you certainly could be. The CASA program could choose to reappoint or to ask you if you'd be willing to be reappointed. My daughter is an ED teacher.
Yeah.
She says that's when they run, when the kids are returned home.
Sure, sometimes. Yeah, sure, certainly sometimes. And that's something we're going to talk in a little bit about, compliance versus behavior change. And that really kind of goes into that. There are some folks who, let's face it, we're all prone to denial. Every single one of us, we're prone to denial. And some folks do try to manipulate the system and fake good per se. And so we have to fight against that and figure out how do we measure behavior change as opposed to compliance. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Thank you. That's a really good point. Creating case plans. This is one of the things that case managers are responsible for. And in that first court report that you're going to read that really gives you the history of the case, it is going to have in it, these are the things that the parents should do right now. These are the parents, these are their services or their tasks right now. And then right after the adjudication, and that'll all be explained shortly, but a couple months later, a formal case plan will be put into effect. What can you imagine is problematic about, what do you imagine parents are thinking when their children are removed in terms of what they need to do or should do? I want to get them back. What do I need to do to just tell me, what do I need to do to get my kids back, right? That's what any of us would be. Just tell me right now what I need to do to get my kids back. And at that PPH hearing, that very, very, very first hearing and that very first court report, we outlined the things that we're guessing make sense. That's 7 days in. And then about a month and a half or 2 months later, a formal case plan is going into effect. What do you see as problematic about figuring that out right then? Do we? We don't know what they need. Exactly. We're guessing. Like we understand that you have a heroin problem, but we don't really know why. We don't know if you need grief counseling. We don't know if you need inpatient, outpatient. So I bring this up because case plans are fluid things. And that's a very hard thing for parents to understand because it would be any of our impulses to want to say, give me my list of things and I'll do them and then you're going to give my child back, right? And that's not realistic because 7 days in, we don't really know what that parents need. You're going to see 7 days in and a month and a half in, you're going to see some things you're going to see for sure. If there are drug or alcohol addiction issues, you're going to see drug testing. You're going to see lots of assessments so we can figure out what you really do need, right? Whether it be psychological assessments or substance abuse assessments. But you're going to see those as being fluid. And that brings us back to that compliance versus behavioral change. Child welfare cases cannot be seen as probation cases. I mean, let's face it, if you're on probation, I used to be a juvenile probation officer. If a kid was on probation, basically, these were the things they needed to do. They didn't have to do them happily. They didn't actually have to get anything out of it. We hoped they did, but they really just had to show up, right? That's kind of what probation is about. It's like being in prison. You do your time. You may come out exactly the same, but you're still getting out on your day of discharge, whether you changed or not, right? Does that make sense in child welfare cases? It's very problematic in child welfare cases. And so we constantly have to, and when I say we, I mean the system. I mean DCS staff, I mean the court, I mean attorneys, I mean CASAs, I mean the team we. We need to be talking with parents about the importance of safety and behavioral change, not compliance. And we need to be making sure that we're getting information from therapists who are working with parents. Okay, it's great that you're saying that mom showed up to 9 of her 10 sessions, but that's not good enough. Were her sessions productive? Is she making progress in her sessions? Are you seeing change in her thought processes, in her decision making? That's the information that is harder to get. It's a lot harder for somebody to articulate those things. And it's a lot harder for people to be willing to do that than to say mom showed up 9 out of 10 times, which is great, So that those are things that we need to be thinking about because in the end, we don't remove children to punish parents. We remove children because they need to be safe until their parent can be safe. And by that behavior change, that's how we try to figure that out. So I think the key is that when sometimes it's the case manager, sometimes it's the child's attorney, sometimes it's the CASA, when we notice something that doesn't seem right or that doesn't seem logical, that we need to ask more questions. Or if we're suspicious, everybody in the room thinks that things are going great with mom, but then I read the visit notes or I read this and and that doesn't seem to gel, and so the importance is that we need to raise those questions because we really need to try to do the best we can. We cannot guarantee that people are not going to fake good or manipulate, and some people are smarter at that than others, but we need to raise the questions when we have concerns, because if that behavioral change doesn't happen, we really cannot feel very confident that the children are going to be safe if we send them home. We can only then suspect that they're going to be in about the same situation that they were in before. So, case plans also, the most important, not the most important, but the first component of every case plan is, what is our goal? So, this is really the listing of what the goal options are legally. This list is entrenched in federal law and in state law. So this is something that's, and I'll tell you some interesting stories. This is not up to my choice or your choice or anybody else's, but it is entrenched in federal and state law that, and I'm going to say a small percentage of our cases do start off with the case plan goal of remain with parent. You might go, when is that? That's when we remove from one parent, but we can place with the other parent who doesn't have any custodial rights right now, but is safe. So we have a small percentage of cases like that, but usually it's family reunification as the first case plan goal. And then if over time that doesn't seem that that's, likely or feasible, then the case plan goal, the next choice would be adoption, and then the next choice would be guardianship, and down the line. What's interesting about this is that this list is sometimes going to confound you, because at least one of you or more are going to be assigned to a case where the case plan goal is family reunification, and you're going to read the circumstances and you're going to go, why on earth are we trying to reunify with this parent that did this hideous thing? That's going to happen. And the reality is that the law says we have to at least try. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about reasonable efforts, because it's going to all make sense then, I promise. So this is the order of preference, because statistically, when children are able to be safely returned home, they do better in their family of origin than they do being adopted by nice families on the other side of town. Statistically, if you read national studies that have been done, it is better for kids to go home when the parents have addressed the safety issues. And then the next goals are the ones that provide the most permanence. So in terms of case plan tasks, this is really the most important part of a case plan. How are we going to get from here to here? How are we going to get to this child being in foster care back to mom or dad? And these are some of the ways that we do that. Case plan goals can include, frankly, anything that makes sense. Usually they include things like drug testing, substance abuse assessments and services that flow out of them, psychological assessments, behavioral health services. A lot of our parents are struggling with addictions. They're struggling with bipolar disorders, depression. The old adage or the old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first? The traits of mental illness or the substance abuse? Who knows for different parents? So we have to figure that out many times. I like to put in a plug for community services. Community services can include things like AA and NA. More and more now than when I started with DCS 20 years ago, we have more parents who are veterans who can get services through the VA that can be a part of their case plan. What's the good thing about community services? Sometimes they're volunteers. Sometimes, or they have access to it. Some families also, I would put under community services that many of our families can get through their tribes. They're free, and what happens when the DCS case closes? They continue. That's the beautiful thing about community services, because a lot of our parents, we give them 100 services, and then we abandon them when the case closes, because everything ends, everybody in their life goes away. So if we can build up some community services, those are services that they can probably continue in after that. But our whole point in providing these services is trying to get children to the best outcome, which, going back to that list, is return to family or adoption or the next best, and we do that through services so that we know that we are providing reasonable efforts. And this links back to earlier when Sue was up here. Some reasonable efforts came up. It's in the code. Reasonable efforts is a legal term that was born out of the 1980 Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act. And I love the idea of reasonable efforts because it is really, in my social worky lay terms, it is the rule of fairness. It basically says that DCS or child welfare agencies in each state must provide services for families where children are removed from the home, and also do alternative permanent planning. Basically, think ahead. So, what does that mean? That means that it's not okay for me to remove your child and say, you know what, here's a piece of paper with some phone numbers. I know you've got some problems. Call some places. We'll have court in 6 months. Good luck with that. Is that reasonable that that's going to be effective? No. Now, reasonable efforts is also not, I'm going to pick you up every day and I'm going to drive you to treatment whether you want to go or not. Because that's not going to be effective either, right? People don't get sober. People don't get stable by other people doing it for them. People do it by having the opportunity to do so, having the services available to them, having us not pick them up every day, but help figure out how are we going to get them bus passes? How are we going to empower them to meet their needs so that they could maintain that after we're gone? So reasonable efforts is that idea of providing services, but also not quite hand-holding, if that makes sense, okay? We need to make things available. The reason that I love reasonable efforts is this. I learned a lesson. When I was 26 years old and I was a baby investigator, I thought I was smarter than I know I'm not now, thankfully. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience in life. I don't know. But I thought I was pretty smart. And I would have cases where I would have to remove a child or children, and I would transfer those cases to the nice, crazy, patient, ongoing staff down the hallway, who I didn't know how they managed to work with the same people for a year and a half, who were driving me crazy. I would transfer the cases down the hallway, and I would, in the back of my head, I would think to myself things like, oh, this case is going to go really well. This mom already acknowledges her addiction. She's in inpatient treatment. If she stays there, the baby's going to be placed with her in 2 months. I have a good feeling. And on top of it, she's nice and easy to deal with, right? Which is always a help. And then I would transfer other cases down the hallway, and I'd be like, oh man, these parents have been beating on each other for 6 years. This mom is never going to leave. He's never going to get in services. It's been getting worse and worse. And on top of it, every time they call me, they're screaming and calling me names. They have no insight. This is not going to go well. And what do you think I learned? I wasn't very smart. Because how people were doing on day 7 or day 14 was not indicative of what was going to happen 6 months down the road or a year down the road. So thank God that I, or a CASA, or even a judge early on in a case get to say, you get a shot and you don't. The other thing I love about it is that it fits with the rule of empathy. If it was me, if it was my child, if it was my sibling or my cousin who was struggling with addictions or mental health problems, I would want them to be given the opportunity to get stable and address it. And so that's really what reasonable efforts is. It's that everybody gets a fair shot. And so, as mentioned earlier, CASAs provide feedback in all of your court reports about whether or not you think reasonable efforts are present or taking place and being provided to the parent. Now, if you have concerns about reasonable efforts, and I will admit I'm talking a little bit for DCS here, but I'm really talking for the CASA program because they want this. If you are assigned to a case and you're like, wow, I do not think reasonable efforts are taking place in this case, I'm really concerned, you should talk to your coordinator about it and bounce it off of them and strategize. Not only, I may need to put this in my court report in 3 months, but in addition to that, how can I address that now? I'm participating in child and family team meetings and probably other types of staffings. There's no point in us waiting. If I have a concern about services, how can I bring that up now? How can we try to address that now? It also can help talking to your CASA coordinator about it can sometimes kind of help balance. Sometimes we think that certain things are available and they're really not available. Or sometimes they are and you might not even know. And so bouncing those things off of your CASA coordinators will help you know, depending on what your background is coming in to be a CASA, you may have a very great understanding of what services are available through behavioral health and DCS, or you might have a lesser understanding that's going to grow during your CASA experience, if that makes sense. Any questions or thoughts about reasonable efforts? Yes.
You're referencing the parents making reasonable efforts?
The department is making reasonable efforts in terms of their provision of referrals and availability of services. Yeah, which is a hard thing because we don't provide all the services. So sometimes we are working hard to get behavioral health to provide mom with inpatient drug treatment, but that's not what was recommended. So that's why those staffings are really important to hash all those things out. Right, and that's where talking to your coordinator is helpful because let's face it, these are kids' lives. If we all had the power, parents would have a psychological evaluation the next week after it was figured out, right? But that's not realistic. I mean, how many of us have called our specialty doctors and wanted to get in the next week and realized 4 months from now is the best we're going to be able to deal with? Unfortunately, that's the reality in our world too. So that really kind of demonstrates the value of and sometimes you might think that something might be 6 months out, and you might think, okay, maybe this is reasonable, and your CASA coordinator might say, no, it's really not. There is a better way to do that. So it's good to talk with them about those things. Thank you for that. I wouldn't say that it was opposite. I would just say that it was random. I think I would say that there were times when cases started out great, that they ended great, and then probably half of the time I thought they started out great and they didn't, and vice versa. So I think it was much more random than I saw it, yeah. And I think all of us are a little prone to connect things with what somebody's personality or demeanor is. And, I remember one family I had that was a reunification, and they were the most frustrating, annoying family I ever had to deal with. Every time I picked up the phone and I knew I had to call the dad back, I was like, oh, but they did great. But they did great in their case and in their services, and they were good parents in the end, But they were never, you all probably know people like that who are good in their jobs or are good doing certain things, but they're not particularly pleasant. Sometimes we put weight in the wrong place in different types of situations. So, yes. Just a couple of things about interfacing with DCS. And I know we have a little bit of time left. I sometimes like to challenge people by asking them to think, there are probably jobs out there in the world that you have thought, oh man, I could never do that job. I know there are jobs on that list for me. What are some of the things that you all might think about that would fall under that?
When I was pregnant with my son, I had always thought about being an EMT.
Oh, sure.
I knew I could never do that, but I was an EMT for almost 8 years, almost 10 years.
Yeah.
So that was something I just knew I couldn't do. I couldn't deal with any of that, but I did it and I loved it and I was good at it.
Yeah. Some things are hard, but they also click.
Yes.
100%. Yeah, I think that. Any other types of jobs that you all think about that way? What about right now, the word is escaping me. Oncologists, the doctors who are basically cancer doctors. Even when they're doing everything right, and it's a normal week, how many people do they have to tell who prayed all night that they didn't have cancer, do they have to tell that they have cancer? What kind of a job is that? Pediatric nurses. I've walked into pediatric wards as a DCS worker, and I know I'm going to have to remove this kid in the end, but I thought I'll do anything other than be a pediatric nurse and work on this ward with these 3-year-olds in these metal cribs by themselves sometimes, And so there are jobs like that. People say that to us a lot. People say, I could never do your job. The reality is it clicks, kind of like the experience that you had. So we're not crazy, but it clicks, but it is awkward. It is like some of those other jobs, because even when things are even when you're doing everything right, and it's a normal week and you're doing even better than the statistics show, you're seeing all your kids, you have a higher percentage of reunifications than what the statewide averages is, there's still X amount of things that are going to be really cruddy that you have to deal with. And so what can be a little awkward about that sometimes is that sometimes people in those roles, things that are terrible start to look normal. And they start to look normal because they have to do it all the time. So sometimes you'll see that a little bit in DCS workers, that they never, and I was in investigations for a long time. It was never a normal or like, oh, I have to go remove these kids today, but I don't really care. It was never like that, and yet you had to do it every week, so it had to become a routine thing, like some of those other jobs. Our case managers are all very different. They are as different and diverse as this room is, in experience, in age, and things like that. Sometimes I tell a joke kind of, or, first impressions are not always so telling. So one or more of you is going to be assigned to a case, and you're going to meet the case manager, and you're going to say, this person is not old enough to have graduated from college. I assure you, they have all graduated from college. We have their transcripts. We're very good about that. But we hire people who are 24 years old, 23 years old sometimes, and think that they're smarter than I thought I was even. But here's the thing. Some of you are going to interface with experienced case managers who are great and have all this knowledge, or the ones that are counting down retirement. And some of you are going to interface with brand new case managers who are going to help the world and are soaking everything in and lighting the world on fire. And some of you are going to come across a new case manager who's like, man, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I am putting applications in right now. So you know what? Experience, age, those things don't matter. Every interaction that you have, you're going to develop an individual relationship with the ongoing case manager on the case that you're assigned. And that relationship is super important. I would encourage you, especially if you have more wisdom or more life experience than the ongoing case manager, meet with them and find out, how does this person tick? What's this, is this a high energy person? Is this a lower energy person? The same way that they should be thinking that way about other folks. But think about those things, because that helps us know the best ways to approach people. How do we communicate with each other? Do some of you have friends you never talk to on the phone, but you only text, but man, she texts like a bandit? Any of you have that friend? Yeah, never talk to her on the phone, but man, the texts, like they just come in. Case managers are like that. Sometimes you're going to talk to the case manager and say, hey, what's the best way for us to communicate? Your state phone, email, what's the best way for us to relay information? We can exchange a fair amount of information on an email without including confidential information. Not necessarily really, really involved things, but things like, hey, I saw JJ this weekend and things were really, really good. If you have a chance, can you call me sometimes when, things like that. Things that give a little bit of information, or I have a concern, but it's not an emergency. Can you get in touch with me in this way? Find out the best ways to interface with each other. Don't be afraid to show kind of your abilities and interests. Some of you are going to have more time to give than others, and that's okay. I had a CASA one time she had been the CASA for a little boy for a lot longer than I was his case manager, and on Saturdays she went and observed kind of meet and greet visits with this little 3-year-old boy and his prospective adoptive mom. I had a baby at home. I wasn't able to work 50 hours a week on weekdays and then go and do that on Saturday right then. But she was like, oh, I'll go and do it. And I was like, well, great, because he knows you a lot better than he knows me. And that's the reality lots of times. Sometimes you're going to be on a case for a year, and you're going to be on the second case manager or the third case manager, and you are going to be the constant. And sometimes it's the other way around. So just to keep those things in mind. And then lastly, I like to touch on that the kids and the families are always watching us. I used to do some trainings with a girl who grew up in the foster care system in Florida, and she there was a period of time in her life when she said the only family she had was her professional family. It was her probation officer, her group home manager, her counselor, and her CPS worker. Her mom was off the rails and her dad was long gone. And she said there were times, and she aged out of care in Florida. She said there were times when she knew when they didn't like each other. Or she knew when her therapist and her case manager were ticked off at each other about something, about who was going to provide what service or whatever. And it really struck me that we have a lot of staffings where we talk about services and we talk about who's going to do what. But it was sad to me that this 16-year-old girl who these people were in charge of her life, she didn't see it as these people at certain times are trying to figure out how to make things happen for me. They're arguing about who has to do what and they're pissed or they're angry at each other. And so sometimes we forget about how things must look from the older kids' perspective who are in our hearings or in our staffings, or how we're modeling for the parents. Because we really do. We all provide modeling to parents who sometimes don't know that you don't show up to court 5 minutes late, or maybe the best way to dress for court and things like that. So we all provide a good example in how we interact with each other. So, but that is no more true for CASAs, and CASAs don't need to hear that any more than everybody else who's a member of the team. That's really a message that is I think, necessary for everybody who's on these families' teams. So that leaves us with any questions that you might have about anything. And don't forget to use the mics. Yes.
Why do classes, or excuse me, why do
DCS staff?
DCS get transferred so much from the kids?
They more times than not, when there's a case manager change on a case, it's not a transfer. It's the case manager decided to not work here anymore. I would say if I had to guess, 2/3 of the time, or maybe even a little bit more than that, it's that the case manager doesn't work, resigned, and 1/3 of the time it's that case manager moved to a different type of position. They'd been a case manager for 3 years, and they had the opportunity to become a supervisor or to become a team decision-making meeting facilitator or something like that. So unfortunately, both of those things create change on cases. And the hard thing is that every ongoing case manager at any given time has between 20 and 40 cases. And so there's never a good time, there's never an okay time for a case manager to leave or transfer. They're always 100% of the time going to be abandoning 20, 30, 40 cases. So there's never a good time to leave. Yeah. Yes?
So other than communications, what would you say are really good lessons learned on collaboration? Or things that you really want to call out so that we're more sensitive toward the teamwork?
Yeah.
Specifically with us too?
I think, and this is omnipresent in my mind because of a problematic case that a couple of us were staffing in Tucson last week. And when I say us, I mean myself and somebody from the CASA program. I would say an understanding of the system barriers and being willing to ask questions about the system barriers because there's a case where there's a lot of conflict between the professionals, and in this particular case, the CASA kind of made some judgments and kind of said some things like, well, why aren't you going to sever right now? Like, why are you not going? And I'm a big believer of you can say anything to somebody in a good way. There's a huge difference between, so communication is really key. There's a huge difference between, well, why are we not going for severance right now? I don't understand. Or, now I'm not clear on the timelines, and I know that mom and dad haven't been doing well lately. Are we at the juncture where you guys are thinking about asking for a change of case plan and severance, or is there a legal reason why that's still down the road a little bit? There's a total difference between those two questions. One is, and really, but the outcome, your question, what you're trying to get at is exactly the same. So, and so in this particular case, I think some questions were asked in a accusatory kind of a way, and then people get defensive, and then they start not being pleasant the other direction, and then it So when relationships don't go well, that's usually what happens. So I would And I think about this all the time. Okay, this is really the information that I'm in need, or this is really my concern. What is the way that I can say this or ask this that is least likely to be interpreted with defensiveness? That is a huge deal. And again, that message no more needs to be heard by CASAs than everybody else in the system. But from your perspective, if I was a CASA, that's what I would be thinking about. How can I gather information? How can I ask questions? But do it in a way that somebody's not going to go, oh, why is she questioning what I'm doing? Because sometimes, and this is again where on our side the work creates problems, is sometimes that case manager is totally going to understand where you're coming from. And if you guys have developed a relationship, you know how over time, we don't have to be as cautious about how we say things because we understand people and they understand us. But earlier on, it's harder. But case managers, they get yelled at in court. They get yelled at by everybody. They're late for home visits, they get yelled at. They get yelled at in court because the psychological evaluation is scheduled 3 months down the road. And they feel kind of beat down sometimes. And so if you come at them sometimes from that perspective, but still knowing, I got to gather information and I have questions I want to get answered. I really think that that's good advice, is just knowing that a lot of our staff who quit, they say the primary reason they do is because they hate going to court and they go out to their car and they cry after court hearings because judges yell at them and things like that. So if you can be somebody who's on the team that feels like a team member to them as opposed to somebody else who's yelling at them, that would be really my advice, because that's reality. And so that is another thing that I just want to give one piece of advice before I maybe turn it over to Sue. That is a challenge because DCS staff are never really used to working with CASAs on a lot of their cases. It's the unique dynamic as opposed to their regular dynamic. So I just want to tell you, when you call a DCS worker and you're like, I'm a CASA, I was just assigned to this case, and especially if they've been a CASA for less than a year, they're like going to be like, I don't know if I can tell you anything. I have to go talk to my supervisor. I'll call you back. Because they're drilled into their head confidentiality and things like this. So like they have no or almost no experience with the previous, and that's a good thing. Sometimes that's a good thing because you are the first good example that they have. You have the chance to be that great relationship with the CASA and they with you. But we don't see a breadth. We don't see the breadth of the work. Yeah, and then I remember, and again, that goes to the communication. When we did that training, we had an example. There was a DCS staff who had, and I'm always open to the idea that there's some exaggeration when we get frustrated, but she purported that she had gotten a message from a CASA that I've been newly appointed to this case, and I need to come and look at the file tomorrow. And then when that case manager was out in the field all day and didn't get that message till tomorrow, and that CASA didn't get a call back, was already escalating to that person's supervisor and that person's supervisor. Now, when I say about communication, when Sue and I were talking about it afterwards, and what I've learned about the CASA program over time is that, well, the hearing was like 45 days away. And so that CASA was thinking, I'm brand new to this case. There's a hearing in 45 days. I got to write a report. I got to have my report to the court 15 or however many days ahead of time. I got to have my report to my CASA coordinator and bounce it off of them X amount of days. So in that CASA's head, I totally get why they were like, I need to start figuring this case out now. But the DCS worker wasn't thinking about it that way. And so there's a big difference, like if I was that CASA and I was feeling pinched, I would want that message to have been, I know you're really busy. I'm newly appointed to this case. It's kind of awkward because court's coming up in a month and a half and I have to do a report like I know you do. And I just am trying to figure out how to get as much information as soon as possible. If you can call me back and we can work something out, that'd be great. That's a better start off than I need to come see everything tomorrow. And the need was exactly the same. So yeah, that was the most thing that we heard from DCS staff. So thank you very much. And as Sue said, if you have questions, make sure to write them down and we'll get them answered in the next day and a half. So thank you.
Thank you.